hit the button 3 times. I forgot.
Oh, we are live now. Hello, Jessica Letaw,
Hello, Patricia Berry.
my white woman friend.
I know, my white woman friend. It is time for us as white women to talk about white women. Mostly the book, not the people. Also
Mhm.
the people, I guess.
But that is part of what they talked about in the book is white women talking about other white women in a
I
not
know.
very helpful way.
And I want to talk about that in this session. So let us start with our working agreements,
Hmm.
and then we will go into the session. So, for folks who are joining us for the first time, welcome. We are discussing the book White Women, Everything You Already Know About Your Own Racism and How to Do Better. And Patricia and I are working on unpacking it in our lives and thinking about it and how these things play out in our communities and bringing you along. Please feel free to add comments and questions. We will address them either as we go along or at the very end. Suzanne and Ella, hello. Really glad you could join us today. Um, we have decided to create a set of working agreements that are sort of bumpers for the conversation that help keep us uh, both safe and brave in this learning space. So I'm going to put them on the screen and then I'll kick us off with the first one. Good. All right. So the first one is we put aside our right to comfort. Over the course of the series, we're going to continue to unpack why we're doing this. But as white women, we are putting aside the right to comfort in this learning. This is not a safe space because the world that we are trying to address is not a safe space. So, this, as a learning arena, is a brave space. I want to invite us, Patricia and myself, and the folks who are coming along with us, fellow unlearners, to loving accountability. Patricia, you and I have known and loved each other for a long time. So let's love each other enough to tell the truth and to hold up mirrors that need holding up. Kindness and honesty, as extensively discussed in this chapter, are not mutually exclusive.
And number two on our working agreements is we ask for the speed we need. I would like to invite us, Jessica and I, to ask for the pace we need. Speaking for myself, when I'm doing deep learning, I often need to go a little slower to let me kind of mull over new ideas. As much as I am a extrovert external processor, I do also have an introverted side that needs some time. So I want to allow us the time we need in order to think and speak. And as a result, you'll hear pauses as we take a minute to breathe and reflect and make sure that what we're saying is true to both our experience as well as how it's developing physically in our body. And also, we want to, as number three in our working agreements, resist binary thinking. I would like to invite us to resist black and white thinking, except where we're specifically talking about race. Right or wrong, either or, I'd like us to resist those concepts because what we're doing here is learning, unpacking, discussing, all of that good stuff. And none of that is necessarily right or wrong at the beginning, but it's evolving into a becoming. So,
And then the last one is that we want to welcome conflict into this space and this learning. So, in dominant culture and in the Midwest, and as women, kind of pick your identity, we are often rewarded for being nice instead of being real, for being conciliatory instead of leaning into disagreement. So, I would like to invite us to allow a lot of emotional space to be in conflict with each other, with the ideas being presented, and even with ourselves. And I think that brings us into space.
mm-hmm.
Let's do a white lady check-in, Patricia. How has whiteness shown up for you this week?
It's interesting because I think you and I have talked over the week how short these chapters are, but how dense they are with thought and kind of cautionary moments about how to be in the world. And so I'm still thinking a lot about in the last chapter performative outrage.
Mm.
So I just did a little clock for myself this week to see how many times I did performative outrage. Like, oh my God, I can't believe X, Y, or Z happens. And it's too much. It's a ridiculous amount. And I think now that I'm more and more aware of it, just sitting quietly and trying to, again, take time and have a more thoughtful response to, things that happen in the world or things that happen to me or people I love, like, just to be a little bit more thoughtful about it. But I think that's my clocking some of my own whiteness and white centered and white privilege and performance of being a nice white lady. I definitely get that.
Mm-hmm. No, I appreciate that. I think for me, has nothing directly to do with the chapter. So this last week, I had a bunch of medical tests run, including, and if there's an actual scientist in the audience, I'm very sorry for what I'm about to say because I'm sure it's wrong. But I had a creatinine test run, something to do with kidney function. This test and its results are functionally invisible for me, not just because I don't understand the science, but because as a white person, this isn't something that I've had to attend to. What I learned sort of completely by accident in the last week, shortly before I had my test, is that this test was actually racially coded for quite some time, from the time that they started running it, which I believe is 1998, up until just a year or two ago. There was a racial factor put into the equation of how creatinine is calculated. And it is because African Americans often present with elevated levels, but they thought it was because of race and not because of correlated factors like stress, like intergenerational trauma, like correlated disease, like things like that. And because of that, over the course of 20 years, as you can imagine, because the equation was incorrect and incorrectly accounted for elevated levels of creatinine, there are a lot of Black folks in the United States who have not gotten kidney care that they needed, whether it was lower level, something palliative, or higher level, probably even coming up to transplants. And that's something that is a lot more visible in the Black community because that was a real shift in how that test was performed. I think 2021 and 2022 is when that equation was redone. And even still, I'm not sure that the implementation in every medical institution is even. I was reading a little bit from the Kidney Foundation about this equation and how it's applied. And as far as I can tell, it's not universal. But, one of the things that we're doing with the White Lady check-in is naming what's invisible. And to me, this creatinine test would have been utterly unremarkable, except for, excuse me, that thing that I learned. Mhm.
That's amazing.
Mhm.
I just want to tell the audience one thing. You may be hearing kind of a weird clicking sound in my environment. We just adopted a new basset hound, and he is right above me, listening to me talk. Or actually, it's Mabel. That's how new this dog is. So I apologize if you're hearing any background noise. There will probably be baying at some point.
Basset
So,
hound's got a basset, man.
basset hounds are basseting even as we speak. So I apologize if you're getting a little feedback from my room.
Okay. So, thank you for the White Lady check-in. What would you like us to talk about next?
I think when you and I were discussing this week, I read the chapter and then I went wandering around the rest of the book. The chapter was very full of information, but was fairly short. So it was a doable read for me. So I did my thing and I wandered into the back of the book, and there's this wonderful glossary of terms in the back of the book. So if y'all go to anybody who has the book, it starts on page 151. And I just thought it was interesting because you and I do talk about terms and, how people are using it. And I think it was either last week or the week before, I used the term for myself that I wanted to be an ally, and you helped me unpack that in our conversation a little bit. So under the glossary, they have a definition back there for them, for the authors, that an ally is something that white women often call themselves, which usually indicates they are anything but an ally. See also white savior. That gave me some pause to sit down. I had to sit down with that for a little while.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you have anything else that you wanted to say around that term in particular.
Not about that term, but in terms of terms, one of the language things that was really prevalent in this chapter, and of course stood out to me a number of times, was sort of positioning niceness and kindness in relationship to one another. Niceness being the superficial kind of minimization of conflict, of presenting positivity to each other and to a situation. Whereas kindness is offering, I'm doing this totally on the fly, I wish I had a dictionary, but kindness is offering contextual generosity to the folks that are around you. And kindness, as we noted in the agreements, kindness and honesty are inextricably tied together. This is thinking about these two terms as separate and niceness as harmful is a journey that I've been on for a little while. And so to have it surface in the book and be an excuse to kind of think about it more was really useful. Patricia and I are both in the Midwest, and Midwest nice like is a thing here.
And
Um,
I'm new to Midwest nice. I was
you're
a New
new,
Yorker for 25 of my adult years.
right? And I lived
And
in Georgia for my first 30. So I
yeah,
have a particular Southern predisposition towards niceness and the performance of niceness. And so in terms of terms, that's just something that continued to come up for me. And I think I'd like to talk more about as we kind of unpack the chapter together.
hmm yeah. I'll read one other definition, but there's so many. I'm going to bring up as we evolve this conversation series
Mhm.
a lot of the terms I would love to unpack more. But the one right underneath ally um, was, for me, a way to recontextualize what it is that I aspire to do. And the word is accomplice. And an accomplice is something to which white women should aspire, never a moniker to bestow upon oneself, but a practice indicating that you see your liberation and your life as tied to the liberation and lives of Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks. We are fighters in the same war against white supremacy, a war that you must win for your own sake and not a pet project that you support and help during your downtime. And it's one of the reasons that word is interesting to me is because accomplice felt without that definition as a term that had some negative weight on it, right? You're an accomplice in a crime.
Mhm.
That I would ascribe more to being an accomplice in white supremacy rather than
Mhm.
being an accomplice in liberation. But
Mhm.
both have equally, for me, now that I've kind of reformulated it,
Mhm.
powerful sense of what kind of trouble do you want to get into. I'd
Mhm.
rather get into accomplished trouble on the
Mhm.
side of anti-racism rather
Mhm.
than on the side of white supremacy.
I actually appreciate that. I've heard accomplice elevated that way in different contexts. And what I appreciate, kind of as you said just now, is that it turns on its head what we assume has the power, right? And what we assume is the good. So I appreciate that term. And I also appreciate that they say that this is not a word you give yourself. You do not put on the accomplice queen crown. That accomplice is a thing that you do. It's a way that you show up. And that was my resistance when you and I talked about ally. That was my resistance, is that I wasn't telling you any way to, engage with that word. I was saying with myself, I have a very uneasy relationship with that word. And I prefer to stay away from it. I prefer to
Mm-hmm.
stay away from nouns in general. I want to come to one of the comments, Susan, that you talk about agreeing with the definition or distinction, but struggle with niceness being bad or negative. I understand that. And given our long history, I won't speak for anybody else. I'm in my fifth decade. I have a really long positive history with the word nice. But what I've been coming to understand over the last year or two is that nice is often a performance, right? Like we are performing niceness, which is not the same as creating genuine connection. And asking nice to do more work I think it was important to come up with another word that got more at what folks were trying to make that distinction. You can't say like the fake nice and the real nice, although fake nice is totally a real thing. But I think letting that distinction exist, letting that space exist, for me is important. So I'm affirming you, Susan, that it was definitely was and is something to sit with. Even now in casual conversation, when I hear somebody say, "Oh, that's so nice,"
Mm.
I pause and I'm like, "All right, what are they saying? Like, truly, what are they saying?" And I don't want to over intellectualize everything all the time, because staying in your head is a great way to escape discomfort that shows up in your body. But I do want to mark it when I hear it just in my environment, and just interrogate it a little bit.
And that's what I really appreciate about all of our conversations is the willingness that we have to pick apart a term to determine, is that work that we think that term is doing, is it really doing what we think it's doing?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's all sorts of concepts and terms that I've stopped using
Mm-hmm.
that I either understood the history or I recontextualized about how it's evolved, how the
Mm-hmm.
term has evolved, and whether it is even my word anymore.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So the niceness in the book, or
Actually,
oh,
can I
sure,
say something
please.
about that? So kind of, how do you say, cabbaging on to that idea of evolving your relationship to a word. They talk in this chapter about tone policing. The name of the chapter, by the way, for folks who don't have the book or haven't read it, is your. I think it's "Your Nice is Evil." Is that right?
Your nice is actually evil.
Your nice is
Period.
actually evil. In this chapter, one of the things that they talk about is tone policing. And I have definitely had an evolving relationship there. I'm going to tell a story that I processed and still makes me deeply uncomfortable. So I moderate a Facebook group called Ann Arbor Humans for Housing for All. Used to be Humans Who Want, so now it's like Humans for All, which is not a thing. Um, Ann Arbor Housing for All. And when I started this group 6 years ago, I had never done anything like this. Moderating a community forum, waiting in online. I've talked about this before. I don't feel like the bulk of my earnest work belongs online. I think the bulk of my earnest work belongs offline in relationship, mostly not super visible to the public. And that is one way for me to operate. And I named in the first session, part of why I'm here is because of that comfort. And I'm looking to kind of shift myself into discomfort mode and learning mode, and how I'm operating. But when I founded the group, see, I'm like, I can feel myself fidgeting because I'm uncomfortable. One of the rules was civility and civil discourse. And what I was after was productive conversation. What I did not recognize at the time, and for years, was the role that conflict played. And that's actually still a tough space for me to hold, less so emotionally now, but it's online. It is very difficult for people to engage in generative conflict. Very often it devolves into name calling or a straw man thing, like, especially when folks have been disagreeing with each other for years. You're not even like shadowboxing at each other. You're shadowboxing, at the thing that they said 2 years ago that you hated. And so moderating that kind of conversation remains very difficult. But part of the reason that this is difficult for me to say is that, enforcing civil discourse is white for tone policing. That is 100% what I was doing. And I failed to account for disparate dynamics in the group. And so I enforced the rules evenly, but it landed much harder on our younger members, on I'm only guessing, but poorer members, folks who are fighting sort of for and from the fringes. And I'm pretty certain that I caused some harm to people in some relationships because I felt like niceness was more important than frankness. So that was definitely that's something that I've been grappling with for a while. It wasn't new to this chapter, but identifying tone policing with niceness, I think, was a connection that I hadn't made before, and that's still something that I'm learning to walk away from.
that feels resonant to me. Take a breath. I know.
It's a lot.
It is. Uh, for the first 6 or 7 years that I was on LinkedIn, it was all my resume.
Yeah.
And it was me talking to other frontline fundraisers about how awesome we are. Congratulate me. I've done X, Y, or Z. And over the pandemic, I just wanted a different experience and started engaging more with people that I was doing community work with. And then that began opening up my network, and that began opening up my network. And there's this really wonderful conversation going on a little section of LinkedIn. Well, it's a huge section of LinkedIn. I guess it's not little. It was a section that me and my white-centeredness and my professionalism was not aware of. And what I believe there's a lot that's going on in this conversation that these social justice people are having is about the word professionalism and the white-centeredness in your professionalism, and it reminds me of the civility. Like, professionalism was always a positive word for me.
Yes.
Like, I come from, barefoot and torn jeans, group of people that, we aspired. That was our aspiration, was to somehow shine it up and to, have a tie or a skirt. Or a million years ago, when I started at Accenture as a consultant, women weren't even allowed to wear slacks to work. That's how old I am. But that whole reconstruction of a word, right, that you felt was like very positive, that my badge of courage was my exceptional professionalism. I'm going to put exceptional in there on purpose, as an exceptional somebody who aspired to be an exceptional female in business. And now I think about some of the ways that I enacted that word on other people, employees, other people on LinkedIn, whether it was judgments or whether it was actually barring them from, gaining what it was that they wanted, because I was the professional police.
That's right. So you gatekept.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the uncomfortable ways that I saw myself in this chapter, one of the sort of mental exercises that I put myself through in this book, is pretty much every paragraph I'm trying to see myself. Like, what am I doing? What have I done? Where does my experience lie in relationship to this content? And obviously I don't find myself in every paragraph, but that challenge is super productive, because again, whiteness is, for myself as a white person, is often by default invisible. And so I have to fight to see it. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to read this book and read this book with you, was to consciously engage that challenge. So in this chapter, one of the things that I realized was, in talking about tone policing, there was, the Post-it notes have started. So now that's where we are. So on page 25 at the top, and you don't have to look at your books, it's not necessary, but just to remind myself of the content, there is a list of statements made by various people of color that are that these statements were made by white folks about people of color, typically not to their faces. So a casual comment dismissing Serena Williams, a casual comment dismissing Muslims, and let me put casual in quotation marks. Somebody who had a name that white folks don't identify as white or European American or American, and so dismiss the pronunciation. And what I saw in myself is that I have heard those comments and I have not stood up for the people in their absence. That niceness, that performance of lack of conflict, like let's just hold to the status quo, was me not saying pronouncing someone's name is a basic act of respect, was not saying someone was trying to get you to hear. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I can think of a specific meeting where there's a lot going on, but there was a specific opportunity where I could have reinforced a Black woman's statement of pain, and I didn't, and I should have. So that was, I think, less tone policing and more a slightly different thing. But what I'm saying is, it's not just what you do; it's what you don't do, and I have reproached myself in this chapter for that, and I want to invite myself to more courage to say the things that need to be said, even and especially when folks aren't around to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Ugh. I don't think that performance of shame and dragging yourself over the coals constantly, I don't think that doing that to excess has value. I do think that reckoning with not meeting, my own goals for myself, my own hopes for myself, and aligning my behavior with my values, that naming that is really important, does not make it any more pleasant or comfortable.
But isn't that part of the growth?
It's totally
I
part of
mean, you have to recognize a name. I did the thing.
I did the thing.
When I think about, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? I did the thing. Here's the details of the thing I did.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the harm that I now see that it created.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to apologize, and now we can move on.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean,
that was a quote in the chapter, actually. Your definition of nice requires you to remain silent. Correct. And when you were talking about accomplice earlier, another term that came to mind was complicity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we are an accomplice in the resistance, the opposite of that is being complicit in the harm. Mm-hmm. And your definition of nice requires you to remain silent. That's complicity, right? 100%.
Yeah. I had another thought about that. So I was, like I said, digging into the back of the book, and there's a guide to unlearning in the back. Mm-hmm. And there's some great questions, one question for each chapter, which I think is very helpful in kind of thinking about the bell that the authors would like to ring.
Uh-huh.
But before you got to that portion of it, there was this paragraph that says, let's be clear, white feminist, it's on page 167, just if anybody's following along. Let's be clear, white feminism is deadly, and it is pretty sad that we have to resort to making these constant comparisons to sexism for white women to see their violent ways, but we do, and it works. Mm-hmm. I think the thing I felt when I read that paragraph is that's how I came to this work. Mm-hmm. When I was in New York, I was deep in my white privilege, as well as I could be whatever kind of girl I was. I was a pretty straight talking, here's the facts. Mm-hmm. This is what we're doing. And I certainly got called a bitch, both to my face and behind my back. Mm-hmm. But it never stopped me from accomplishing what I was aiming for. It's like, you can call me whatever you want. Enjoy. Mm-hmm. But once you stop my forward progression, then it's a problem. I didn't experience the stopping in New York. And when I came to work in the university system in Michigan as a fundraiser, I experienced a whole flavor of sexism that I had never experienced before. Mm-hmm. Even though, my shit was correct. Mm-hmm. They just didn't like me. I got accused of being mean. Mm-hmm. I got accused of being abrupt. You should be nicer. You should dress different. Your hair, your tattoos, like you name it. At one point I had a bald head because I was going through chemo. They didn't like my bald head. Felt like I should wear a wig. Mm-hmm. None of that had anything to do with the work that I was doing and the level that I was doing it at. And that's the beginning of the door opening when I suddenly realized that all of that thing that I'm experiencing is something I'm also enacting mm-hmm. on other people through me centering my whiteness, mm-hmm. Wanting to get mine, and then I'll help somebody else up. Mm-hmm. But first I'll get mine because I'm first in line, right?
Right.
So thinking about that in terms of the niceness, as well as, for me, this is complicated because I feel like I'm grateful that I experienced that sexism so overtly.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the tool is the tool. Whatever brings me to the work, inevitably imperfect, because of a centering in whiteness for my whole life, and blindness to the racism
Mm-hmm.
that I was enacting myself.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's just one of the little thought processes that I had in there, that it upped my empathy that should have been upped before, but it
Mm-hmm.
was
Right.
tone policing,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about that as well in the
And
context. Oh, please.
no,
Go ahead.
please, I interrupted. Go ahead.
I was just saying, in the concept of professionalism, how often did I tone police people
Mm-hmm.
because I felt like X, Y, or Z wasn't
Mm-hmm.
appropriate in the professional space, until I began to feel so much like I wasn't able to be myself in the professional space for all sorts of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
co-conspirator
Mm-hmm.
in the revolution.
So I see conversation happening in the comments. I really
Oh, thank you.
appreciate that. For folks who, if you have a question about something that we've talked about or not talked about so far, if you have something that you're wrestling with, an uncertainty or something that feels really muddy, please feel free to put that in the comments. Towards the end of our conversation, Patricia and I are going to pivot to that and sort of engage what you've dropped in there. I wanted to offer something in the meantime, which is a slight pivot from the tone policing, but it directly addresses something that they get at in the chapter, which is that white women do not just enact this niceness on people of color, we do it to each other too. And that one landed so hard for me
I
this week.
agree.
I recently had an interaction with someone who kept saying, actually, I wrote down, there was an interaction in the book that was between Syra and Regina and someone who was trying to book them for anti-racism work within her company. And they said something that made her, the business owner, uncomfortable. And she sat with that for a moment. And then she said, if you were nicer, it would be easier for me to work on anti-racism. Uh, and they pretty much immediately parted ways, and the woman followed up with an email that said, let's agree to disagree on your methodology. I have the utmost respect for what you're doing. I want to pause on that because both are not true. Let's agree to disagree on your methodology. I do not want to do what you're doing the way that you're doing it. I have the utmost respect for what you're doing. The niceness statement, right? Without saying that she's uncomfortable, why she's uncomfortable, the fact that that discomfort is inconsistent with how she wants to run her business. She wants to be seen as doing anti-racism work, but not engage in any discomfort doing it. I had that happen with a white woman recently who she and I are in a a professional relationship together, and we're working on co-creating something. And I'm trying to decide which part of this story to tell because there's so much of it that was this exact interaction. But she was asking for a document, and she kept saying, "I love what you've provided. Can you add this refinement?" And so I would do that, and then she would say, "I love what you would provide. What you provided. Can you add this refinement?" Which was kind of the same thing that she had asked for the first time. And I was like, "Oh, okay, well, let me add that." And it took 2 or 3 rounds of this before I said, I am clearly not understanding your request. Can you please help me understand?" And she said, this is literally what she said. She said, "I was trying to be nice." And then said something entirely different
Oh,
that had
God.
nothing to do, right. That had nothing to, it was a criticism of a different area of our work.
The amount of time and the weight associated with that is not kind, is not kind. This is my pointy, judgy finger.
Right.
That it just exhausts me as a New Yorker who's just like, why can't you just say that you don't like X, Y, or Z?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that you'd prefer that it was this flavor.
Right.
And the concept of how white women are first and foremost unkind to other white women in kind of a Hunger Games situation, right? We've been enculturated to do this.
Yeah.
When so-and-so's out of the room, we're going to talk a little bit of trash, but we're going to say it in a bless your heart sort of way.
Yeah.
And it's something that I have recognized from childhood. So I grew up in Idaho and then at 18 moved to New York and felt like I had been separated at birth from New York. Because everybody in New York was fairly, WYSIWYG. What you got was what you saw was what you got, at least in my blinkered existence. But in Idaho, they would say one thing when they met something totally different. And so I grew up never feeling like the sand was solid, that I always kind of felt like I spend so much time and energy being paranoid. But, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Like, like I'm fairly sure that those things happen on a regular basis. And I try to just sit quietly and, well, if you don't say it, I can't fix it. I can't address it. I can't learn from it. We can't repair this relationship. We can't move forward. And thinking about us as accomplices is also about freeing us from that weight. Like, imagine what we could achieve, everybody, if we didn't have to have that constant
waste our time with niceness,
wondering, and that difference between niceness and kindness. Kindness can be direct. Kindness can say, right now, this is the end of whatever this is. Don't put any more effort into that.
That's right.
And I'm, it's going to feel a little bit, there's going to be some feelings associated with that, but I'd rather have that 30-second ouch to 2 days of like, what the hell was going on there?
And you know what that is too? That's authentic connection.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Trust.
When you can be uncomfortable with someone and know that on the other side of that is learning and honesty and continued work. Right. So that's one of the things that I think I had a real flip. I've been thinking about generative conflict for a while, but I had a real flip relatively recently in the last few months of understanding that generative conflict, productive conflict, loving conflict actually produces much more authentic, much more connected relationships. I kind of got goosebumps because I don't really think I internalized
We were not taught it.
We weren't taught
the opposite.
I understand that, but I also I want to give myself the responsibility of I had many opportunities to seek this out before. I had many relationships that I've cherished where folks have brought difficult things to my attention, and I'm not thinking of a specific example right now, but I am 100% certain that I responded nicely. And so I'm just saying that, like, please just don't waste my time, don't waste our time. And when you were talking about white women doing this to white women first, one of the things that came to mind was the call is coming from inside the house, right? Like,
no. It's true. I can't tell you, like, there was a point in my life that I was like, you know what? I can no longer care and I want to pay attention to, have I made it okay as possible for you to be direct with me? I recognize the other side of that, right?
Yeah.
My power in various situations, my authority in various situations, like, am I doing my work to make you feel welcome? But there's only so much I can do. And then I just have to let it go. Like, if you don't say it, I can't help it.
Right.
I can't worry about it. And that.
But even omission is kinder than niceness.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, like, every co-living house I've had, we've always had those agreements. If you don't say it, it's not real. Well, I mean, that's me trying to be kind, right? That's not kind.
Right.
But yeah.
So I wonder if we can transition to the comments and keep having this conversation. I'll lift up Suzanne's first, which is that how did we come together to discuss this? Well, it was Patricia's idea, so let's start there. Um,
Well, yeah.
it was, yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to come along with it because Patricia is somebody I know who has done earnest and uncomfortable work in identifying whiteness and racism inside her, and identifying her relationship to the patriarchy, to the racist patriarchy, to the capitalist racist patriarchy. She's done work that I trust. And she and I have had many honest and kind conversations with each other where we have held up a mirror that I think, speaking for myself, from a lot of people, would have been much harder to see than someone I know who has, my best interests at heart. And so I felt like I could have an honest conversation that challenged me, that pushed me into discomfort areas, and that would help me learn.
And this is also a process of a few years that Jess and I, it's one of the precious few friendships, I'm still trying to grow more,
Mm-hmm.
where we work on our friendship the same way that I would work with a couples therapist with a partner.
Mm-hmm.
That we often will sit down and talk about boundaries, and there's something that's going on between us that is making me uncomfortable. Is it okay to talk about that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that I treasure so deeply with Jess is she brought me into a whole new world of you can talk directly and trustingly with people you love if you begin to ask permission to do that about hard things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I think we developed very early a method of being together and a method of asking for what we need that I just hadn't had in any other friendship. So it's a very comfortable to come to this place. Like, I don't think we could have done it 5 years ago.
I couldn't have. Speaking for myself, I couldn't have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that we had been in practice.
Mm-hmm.
We have developed this practice.
Mm-hmm.
And from our practice, we have invited other people into the practice. And then we go out to other relationships. We take this practice that we're doing here and we take it out. So it's a very, hopefully, it's a very infectious method of doing business in community.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that answers your question. You have to kind of find your person and then you got to start working on it.
There's that. And I want to come to the last part of your question, Suzanne. I'm going to put it back on the screen, which is, would love tips on how you started this conversation together. Trust, certain amount of knowledge, boundaries / working agreements. Cannot emphasize enough how much working agreements that you co-create and both trust allow you to kind of get weird and messy, because you know what the bumpers are. We know that we have no right to discomfort, but we also know
No right
that
to comfort.
no right to comfort. Thank you. But we also know that we can ask for the speed we need. That if our bodies are overloaded, that if something's going on, we can slow it down, right, and get to the point where we can engage productively. So that's where I would start, Suzanne, really and truly. And I would say, don't start big. Start with who you know, start with what you know. Even if what you know is what you don't know, right? Like, you don't have to, your knowledge doesn't have to be perfect before you put yourself in front of someone else and say, let's learn together.
And ask directly for what you want to create.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is what Patricia did. So the next comment I would like to bring up, and this isn't a question, but I appreciate it. So Ella says, at the end of the chapter, it talked about white women not having a community. And it reminded me of a TikTok trend in February, Black Girl Follow Back Train. How productive, how generative. I love that. And I'm guessing, Ella, you mean white women weren't included. Or we freaked out they weren't included. Like, we aren't the center of everything, and other people can have community. We must have our own by dropping the nice. Yep. 100%. And Ella, I'll say too, Ella and everyone, I'll say too, one of the things that is a growth edge for me is understanding, who am I white woman friends with? And what I'm saying is, how are we acknowledging and folding in race and whiteness into our friendship. Because again, for me, that's really a point of authenticity. And what I'm coming to understand is that my most meaningful projects where I can dig the deepest are the ones where we really actively pull in whiteness with deep imperfection. And I still feel all the time like I can push myself more, but folding whiteness and conversations about whiteness into my relationships has been key, has been really key.
The one thing I'll say about that too
Mhm.
is there's some people in my life who have wandered away as
Yes.
I have begun to name that and to be more direct with that and to include that in our conversations.
Yep.
And while parting can be painful, I also really deeply believe it's made space in my life so that new relationships that are more in line with where
Mhm.
I'm growing and who I'm becoming is made possible. And that's both in my business life. I feel like that, you know, naming my whiteness, naming the work that I'm doing in this space as we talk about sharing wealth, like a lot of people wander away from that.
Mhm.
But also, too, it just gives more and more opportunities for people of resonant
Mhm.
work to come
Mhm.
closer.
That values and vision. Ella, excuse me. Ella, I see your comment that you're in a book club and you asked to post a link. I really appreciate you asking. I'm fine with that. Patricia, I'm checking with you. Good.
I'm double thumbs up. All the books, all the book clubs.
Something.
Ella, thank
Yes.
you for leading that too. That's
Mhm.
awesome.
Yep. So I want to bring in Susan's comment. Direct kindness requires some level of vulnerability and trust where both parties can be open to genuine feedback and growth, right? Man, Susan, I think you're the first person to say vulnerability in this conversation, and I'm so glad you did. That I think is at the heart of putting aside the right to comfort. So yes, where both parties can be open to genuine feedback and growth. And man, that's hard, right? That's hard to create. That's hard to trust that that's going to happen. But direct kindness requires all of those things. I think you're absolutely right. What do you think, Patricia?
Could I offer a nuance to that?
Please.
Um, so Jess and I had a lovely little touch base before we came on here that um, part of my work in this is me having complicated feelings about the Buddhist community in America that I'm a part of. And one of the things that I think a lot about is how I can only affect myself and I cannot affect other people, other than creating a space within myself that allows for all sorts of things, essentially just a radical acceptance of this is going to be uncomfortable or whatever. I think that vulnerability is the important part. I don't necessarily have to trust the person I'm in conversation with if I can accept that they may not like me, they may not like what I'm saying, they they may have all sorts of feelings that are not me. But as long as I'm acting directly, that's the only thing that I can actually affect and have control over.
That's true.
Um,
And that vulnerability, if you are vulnerability in a place without trust, and Brene Brown, who talks a lot about vulnerability, also says that there is no vulnerability without risk, right? So that's absolutely a necessary part of it, but it is with the understanding that it may not be treated kindly. It may be treated nicely, but it may not be treated kindly. So yeah, I appreciate that nuance, Patricia, for sure. I felt like I wanted to say something to that, but I think I was wrong. So we're going to bring that back. For folks who are in the comments, Ella dropped in the link to her book club. Thank you for doing that. That link will stay live after this conversation is done. Uh, I will bring Ella up again. Says, is this weekly? Yes. We are here until the Monday before Memorial Day, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. White Women Talk White Women. We create the events as we go, so you can't get there early. But directly after this, I will be creating on LinkedIn the link for the live, which I will drop into this chat. And yeah, I hope you guys can come along for the conversation. And when you say this is fantastic, so is the chat. I really appreciate you guys connecting with each other. That's as meaningful, at least as meaningful as anything Patricia and I are doing up here.
and Ella, I'll meet you in the chat rooms at Race to Dinner. I just joined today. So I'm going to imagine that maybe that's how you heard about us, is I posted in one of the chats. They were very
Interesting.
kind in reposting that for us.
So I wonder, we hit the end of the chat, which is great. You guys feel free to drop in a couple things or anything else that you're thinking of that's on your mind. If you've got something coming up in the next week, if you'd like to invite the group to help you think about how to approach something, please drop that in. I wanted to say at least one thing before we break, which is something that's super timely. So there is a quote in the chapter that says, white society does not treat loud women of color with kindness. And maybe in the last 24 hours, you've heard about Angel Reese, and a women's basketball player who fairly aggressively celebrated a win and was immediately castigated by commentators and fans and, general culture. I don't even know where all of these voices come from, but apparently a lot of people had big feelings about how she celebrated a victory on the court. So that in itself is an affirmation of the content in this chapter. Part of the reason that I wanted to bring it up is because of one response that I saw to it that I loved. So the Black women that I follow on Instagram, which is where I was today, there was a lot of affirmation of Angel and Shikari and other women athletes who have celebrated in ways that white culture finds improper, unprofessional, to your point earlier. And Levy Ajayi Jones, who is a speaker and thinker that I love following for her both irreverence but deep reverence for the possibilities of the human spirit. And she posted something for Angel and for all women of color who are taking up space and making their voices heard in the world. She says, do not break yourself down into bite-sized pieces. Let them choke. That is clear.
I feel like that's a mic drop.
That is clear.
Can I add one ending thing?
Please.
First of all, I'm just going to sit with that. Can you read it one more time?
Do not break yourself down into bite-sized pieces. Let them choke. And that's from Levy Ajayi Jones.
I feel like that's a banner if I ever saw one. With that, I hear offline as well as online about are we all going to get together? I am outside of Detroit Metro, between Detroit and Ann Arbor, Michigan. There's a little tiny town called Ypsilanti. And I am willing to host an in-person for anybody who's in the area who wants to come on out. I'll pick a date. I'm traveling a little bit, but I'll pick a date in one of our local coffee houses. We're a lovely and weird little community down here that if you're social justice flavored, you will dig the coffee scene. So I'll post that. So feel free to either connect with me on LinkedIn or follow here. I'll try to post it in the comments as it gets closer and we make an event. But I also encourage you, do a shout out to your community. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't even have to be evolved. You could come with a draft set of working agreements and, work out the working agreements and then decide if y'all are going to meet again. And that's kind of how this stuff goes. Sometimes it comes together in a lovely way and sometimes people wander away, but I think the work is the work, right? We keep inviting, we keep asking, we keep having the conversation. Yeah. Keep showing up. So keep an eye out here and I'll do an in-person in Ypsilanti, but I also would love anybody who's doing an in-person in their local place to also promote it through our comments. We're happy to talk about it and to link to it, anything to further the work.
I just want to appreciate everybody who was able to join us today and in the future. This recording is going to stay on our pages, so for folks who are able to come along after the fact, hello, welcome. I hope this was useful. Patricia, I just really love doing this work with you. This was an uncomfortable chapter in some ways that I didn't quite expect. And I think I described it on Facebook as productively uncomfortable. And I really looked forward because I knew that you and I were going to be talking about this. And I was like, I'm going to process it. I'm going to take this discomfort and then I'm going to move it closer to action and change. So thank you for being that person for me.
Thank you. As always, make my heart happy.
See you guys next week.